Hey guys, I'm Heidi Priebe. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. This month on this channel, we're talking about self-esteem. And today in particular, we're talking about complex PTSD and some of the messages you may have internalized early on in life that made it really hard for you to develop proper self-esteem as you grew up. So essentially, when we're looking at any form of trauma, what happens when the brain is traumatized is that it's not able to put your experiences into proper context. So in the case of something like single instance trauma, which is most often what we think of as PTSD, the brain ends up retaining either too much information about what may be relevant to that event. So if something traumatic happened and at the time it happened, you were looking at someone across the street wearing a red shirt, your brain might internalize red shirts mean danger. And then in the future, when you see a red shirt, your body is going to respond with a trigger. Or you might retain not enough information about the traumatic event. So if you go into a dissociative response, it's possible that you won't be forming memories properly around what led to that event, which could lead you to underestimating danger in similar situations in the future. So essentially, when it comes to trauma, what we're looking at here is the fact that trauma disrupts our ability to process memories properly and to put our memories into proper context. And in the case of complex PTSD, which is what we call a series of traumatic events that happen to us, usually early on in life, at a time when our brains were still developing, we have entire systems of meaning we form around incomplete forms of processing. So when we grow up with CPTSD, often we grow up with a series of mental health challenges, neuroses, difficulties in certain areas of our lives. And because we don't have the ability to make sense of why we're struggling with all of those things, and because we don't see them as what they are, which is trauma responses, we develop a sense of toxic shame, which is this idea that something I don't understand is wrong with me. Ergo, everything bad that happens to me in life is my fault, and there's nothing I can do about it. Because if I'm being honest, I don't really understand why I am just so different and bad and flawed relative to everybody else. And so what I want to go over today is what it would have been like had you had someone who I almost want to encourage you to think of as a spirit guide, guiding you through your early life and helping you understand and make sense of why you were developing in a way that was not necessarily similar or identical to the people around you, and how you could lend yourself compassion in those areas instead of ascribing all of them to the fact that there is something wrong with you. And the reason I want to encourage you to think of this as more of a spirit guide than a parent figure is A, because your parent figures may have been the source of your trauma if you have complex PTSD, but also B, because it's highly likely that even if your parents were incredibly loving and doing their absolute best, they did not have the language and context themselves to help you make sense of your experiences. If they had, they would have done it, and you would not have developed the trauma symptoms that you developed. So without further ado, we're going to get into 10 lessons it may have helped you to understand in childhood that you can now retroactively apply to your understanding of yourself if you grew up with complex PTSD. First lesson that I wish every person with CPTSD had known in childhood is that the neurotic behavior and emotional regulation strategies you almost definitely developed if you have complex PTSD are not character defects. They are trauma responses. So if you have trouble with things like eating disorders, substance abuse, social difficulties, obsessive thought patterns, chronically low self-esteem, all of these things and many other things that you may have been struggling with are not things that you chose. They are the mind and body's normal response to a set of abnormal circumstances. So if you are missing some key element that you needed for healthy emotional development, your brain is going to do the best it can in order to help you self-regulate. And your brain's best attempt at self-regulation, if it doesn't have the tools to actually contextualize your emotions and make sense of what you are feeling and why, is going to be to develop things like really rigid behavior patterns, addiction, anxieties, depression in a lot of cases. And all of those things are going to make it difficult to do things like give yourself a sense of stability in life or to form healthy attachment relationships, because you simply did not learn enough of the necessary skills to do those things in the quote-unquote normal way. But none of that was a choice, which is likely what you were led to believe growing up if you didn't have any context for why you were doing any of that. You probably learned, I am just doing all of this weird stuff and behaving in weird ways because I am a different, flawed, wrong, broken person. But I'm going to say it one more time. Anyone who grows up emotionally deprived or in some other significant way traumatized, who does not receive the proper care and support that they need to make sense of that, will develop neurotic patterns of thinking and feeling and behaving as a result of that trauma. This would have happened to anyone in your shoes. It is not something that you chose. So the idea we're trying to get at here is that the toxic shame you feel is not as personal as you might think it is. It is the normal response to the life that you had, not a true reflection of the quality of your soul. Second thing you may never have learned if you have complex PTSD, that the average secure person actually intuitively knows, is that it is almost impossible to concentrate when you are dysregulated. So when you are in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, your body is pumping blood to the areas of your brain that are designed to help you escape danger and stay alive. And those are not the parts of your brain that help you to focus deeply on details or on abstract thinking. But focusing on details and abstract thinking is a lot of what school is as we grow up. It's a lot of what work entails as adults for most of us. And so a lot of us who grew up with complex PTSD might be really, really hard on ourselves around the fact that we struggle so much with focus, when in reality, that is a normal response to being in chronic fight or flight mode. It's not because you just don't have the grit to get through things that you find unpleasant. It is in large part because you are chronically triggered. The most beneficial and deeply unexpected part of doing trauma and attachment healing work for myself has been watching my attention span expand exponentially. So being able to actually stay present with people and with tasks, and to be able to stick with really complex trains of thought for longer periods of time. The reason why we get smarter when we heal our trauma is because our brain is actually able to context which situation we are in, so it's not chronically responding to small triggers anymore. And so we're able to take the appropriate cues from our environment that tell us, I'm safe, I'm okay. Ergo, it's safe for the blood to flow to the areas of my brain that are more important for deep focus than they are for self-protection. So if you had something like a spirit guide or a really wise elder who was with you in your childhood, something I feel pretty sure they would have told you is that the fact that you have so much trouble focusing is not because there's something wrong with you. It's because you're emotionally dysregulated most of the time. And the most secure person in the world, faced with that degree of emotional dysregulation, without a reprieve from it or a way to understand it and how to work with it, would also have every bit as much trouble concentrating as you do. And this is something that as we do trauma work, we can start to heal from. But the first step in that process of healing from it is simply acknowledging that there is a reason it's happening, and it's not a moral failing. Third thing you may not have internalized if you have complex PTSD, but that it's incredibly important to understand, is that people need the most help, care, empathy, and support when they are struggling the most. So when we have toxic shame, there's a very quick calculation our brain tends to do when we mess something up, make a mistake, or get something wrong. And it goes, now is the time to double down on self-criticism. The reason the brain thinks it's time to double down on self-criticism after you have made a mistake is because you probably had a very high cost of mistake early on in life. So getting something wrong led to very severe consequences. And when that's the learning model that the brain develops around, your brain starts prioritizing not getting things wrong above trying to get things right. So your brain essentially becomes an inhibition machine much more than a learning, exploring, and growing machine, which is what a healthy child is supposed to be doing. Their parents or their caregivers are meant to hold them in healthy environments where they feel safe enough to try, make mistakes, get things wrong, and then receive love and mentorship when they get things wrong. So when they mess up, when they are acting out, when they are not behaving, a healthy caregiving environment recognizes this is a child who needs a little bit extra care and support. A child who gets that care and support when they're struggling early on in life also learns as an adult when I am struggling, when I am making a higher than average amount of mistakes. That's an indication that I need a little bit of extra love, care, and support from myself right now or from the people around me. And so instead of going inward into that critical parent self and doubling down on self-hatred, they tend to turn outward to their friends and loved ones who can give them a little bit of extra support and guidance, or towards their loving inner parent who can help them understand and make sense of the mistakes that they made so that they're actually able to learn from their mistakes instead of just keep them super present in their awareness to avoid making the same one again in the future. A little anecdote that I really like in this department is I remember seeing some sort of Facebook post, I think, about 5 to 10 years ago, where they were talking about how there's this village somewhere in the world where anytime someone messes up or hurts someone else, that person gets put in the center of a circle, and all of the other villagers surround them and remind that person in the center of all of their strengths and all of the things that are good about them. And that's something that I really want you to imagine and try to keep alive inside of your imagination the next time you make a mistake, if you're someone with complex PTSD. What would it be like right now to put myself in the center of all of my most loving and compassionate parts and remind myself of all of the things I'm doing right and all of my own strengths? Because this is the kind of thing that is actually going to help you get in reality and start learning from your mistakes and taking more chances instead of just doubling down and inhibiting based on a fear of retribution. Which blends pretty naturally into the fourth thing that if you had complex PTSD growing up, you probably did not internalize, but it would have been wonderful if you had, which is that it is normal to not know things that you have never been taught. And it is also normal to not know things that you have been taught, but that you were dissociated while they were taught to you. Because if you are in a state of low or high grade dissociation, you are by definition not forming memories properly. And a lot of people with complex PTSD spent a great deal of their early years intermittently dissociated. And then we can develop all of these areas of deep shame where there are basic life lessons that other people learned really early on and that we know we were technically taught as well, but that for whatever reason, we can't seem to remember well enough or keep our focus on those areas. And so we feel embarrassed as adults about all of these kind of knowledge and skill gaps that we might have. But it is a perfectly normal thing to not be able to remember and internalize information that our whole selves were not online for during the learning process, because the learning process requires us to be both emotionally and intellectually present. And the thing is, when we grow up with so many of these knowledge and skill gaps, we often start to internalize a deep sense of shame around everything that we don't know. And we often don't even stop to check in and go, have I ever learned this thing? Maybe I'm at a new job and my supervisor is explaining the rules to me, and they might actually be expecting me to stop them and ask questions around what I don't understand. But if I have this deep internalized shame that I should just already know everything, regardless of whether or not I've been taught it, I'm probably not going to stop and ask questions as they come up. I'm just going to notice what I don't understand and then go into a shame spiral about it, because that's what my brain naturally learned to do. Again, to avoid making the potential mistake of asking for clarification on something. And then let's say months later, our supervisor realizes that we did not, in fact, understand everything they were saying. They might be really confused and go, I don't understand why you didn't just stop and ask me questions about what you didn't know. But for the person with complex PTSD, the idea that you don't know something because you're so used to having those experiences of skill and knowledge gaps is so shame-inducing that you might not even be stopping in your day-to-day life to sort out, what do I not know because I was dissociated when learning it early on in life, which is where you might have that shame naturally arise, versus what do I not know because I actually have never been taught it full stop in a dissociated or associated state. And in either case, it's really beneficial to give ourselves compassion. But it's also important to note that sometimes we are assuming we ought to know things that there is no way we could possibly know. We cannot know anything we have not been taught. So it's not inherently shameful to have a knowledge gap. And it's also not shameful to have knowledge gaps around things we were dissociated when learning. But this is an awareness you likely have to wade into very slowly as you heal from complex PTSD and learn that you now exist within a world where it's safer than it once was to not know. Fifth lesson you may not have learned growing up if you grew up with complex PTSD is that in order for your life to feel meaningful, you have to get to know yourself and figure out what your unique wants, interests, and passions are, and then you have to align your life with those things. When you grow up with complex PTSD, one of the top things you internalize is that you cannot trust your feelings. Your feelings, if you express them fully, are likely to lead to significant repercussions. And so, you probably instead learn some version of, I'm going to look around me, check on what everybody else is doing, and then try to copy what other people are doing without stopping to check in, see how I'm feeling, and what I want to do, and then build my actions around that. And while that strategy does often help us avoid significant consequences or punishments, it also does not allow us to figure out what is going to make our life feel deeply satisfying. So if you feel like your life is perpetually kind of empty, and even things that make other people really happy don't seem to do it for you, it's probably not because you're broken or just have something inherently wrong with you. It's probably because there was a lot of shame in the way of you truly getting to know yourself growing up. And so you weren't able to make decisions from a meaningful place. And I do have a video on emotional neglect that I've linked in the description of this video that's going to go over some signs that this might be the thing you're struggling with, as well as how to start getting back in touch with yourself. But the idea here is that one of the things you might be missing major context on if you grew up with complex PTSD is yourself and who you are and what matters to you. And all of those things are what goes into building a life that feels meaningful. Sixth thing you may not have learned if you grew up with complex PTSD is that your triggers are not your core authentic self. So when I think of someone with toxic shame or complex PTSD, I kind of think of the self concept as three-layered. So on the top layer, there is the mask or the fake self that you learn to present to the world in order to get by in life. And underneath that mask, there's this layer of trauma triggers. So things like your neurotic or obsessive patterns of thinking and behaving, or your emotional dysregulation, or your challenges with forming and maintaining healthy, intimate relationships. And you might think, if you have complex PTSD, that that second layer is your core authentic self. So when you hear other people say, just be yourself, just let other people get to know you, you think, no, you don't understand. My core authentic self is a bad, broken person. If other people got to know that person, they would hate me. But in reality, there's a layer that exists beneath that layer. And what exists beneath that layer is the raw core of you. So the part of you that just feels things very clearly and cleanly and directly, the you who is able to think and sense make around those things in a clear way, and often that version of you is the version of you that you spend the least time with, because layer 2 involves so much shame for you and tells you the story that whatever is beneath here is definitely going to be completely wrong. And once again, I have a video that goes over this in more detail called Toxic Shame, How It Leads to Chronic Dysregulation. It is linked in the description of this one. But the idea is that you mistake your traumatic responses for your core self. Those things are not the same thing. And the beautiful thing about this is that the more we gain an awareness of who our true selves are, and of the fact that there is absolutely nothing wrong with us in our raw, authentic state, that place becomes the solid ground that we can start standing on in order to gain the strength and perspective to start working with our trauma triggers and our neuroses and our toxic shame, all of which are a very long process. But again, that process begins with recognizing that there's a difference between you, your core self, or your soul, if that's an easier thing for you to think of it as, and you, your dysregulated, traumatized, triggered self. One is a series of responses that you developed as a normal reaction to the circumstances you were in, and the other is your utterly lovable humanity. And that's the thing that we start to uncover and interact with more and more as we move through the healing process. Seventh thing, it may have been helpful for you to know growing up with complex PTSD is that a lot of time when you are procrastinating, what you are actually doing is spending the appropriate amount of time responding to really intense and overwhelming feelings. If we are living with this chronic toxic shame, our brains are going to be spending a lot of time desperately trying to get us out of that shame state and trying to get us to find anything in our environment or in ourselves that makes us feel okay and like it is a good thing for us to want to keep getting up in the mornings and trying again. And so if you have a high number of things in your life that trigger you into a toxic shame spiral, which is highly likely if you have complex PTSD, essentially, anytime one of those triggers goes off, you are no longer in relationship with the thing you were doing that triggered that thing. You are now in relationship with your own trauma response. And that is a very time-consuming thing to be in relationship with. So as an example of this, let's say you have a lot of anxiety around doing your taxes or getting some other thing done that the average secure person maybe doesn't like doing but doesn't have a trigger around. And maybe the reason why it feels so challenging for you is because every time you think of doing your taxes, you have an image conjured up in your brain of an authority figure who there is going to be a humongous repercussion for you around if you get one thing wrong. And so now you're trying to do this task that is complex, but not impossible. But your brain is responding to it as though you are in extreme danger. So your fight or flight response comes online. And now you can't focus. And now because you can't focus, you might go into that toxic shame response of why can't I do even the simplest task? And as soon as toxic shame is activated, now your entire system is trying to regulate you out of that state of shame. And so now what you're dealing with is multiple simultaneous triggers. And this is much different than trying to do your taxes in a regulated state. But that might be the only thing that you are conscious of yourself doing because you're not used to tending to your inner emotional world as something that is real. So if you think, I have this whole day to do my taxes and I'm not doing them, you might come up with stories like, well, I'm just a lazy person who doesn't care about myself. When in reality, what's actually happening for you, if you have those triggers online when you sit down to do your taxes, is you are now managing a humongous amount of trigger and shame. And those things are deeply time-consuming. Any secure person who is hit with a trigger and a shame response as large as the ones that you may frequently experience would also need hours upon hours upon hours to try to regulate themselves around that. And so this is a framing I actually tend to find really helpful when it comes to those small tasks that feel triggering. Instead of saying, I spent 8 hours trying to fill out one form today, I can tell myself, I spent 8 hours managing my toxic shame today, and 1 or maybe 0 hours filling out the form. But I did not spend 8 hours trying to fill out the form. That is not accurate. I spent my time and energy responding to a trigger that came up. If you live with chronic triggers, you do have less hours in the day than the average person, in the sense of you have less time in the day when you are regulated and therefore able to deal effectively with the tasks in front of you. And again, I say this not to be discouraging because this is absolutely something that can and will change during the healing process. But I say it as a means of helping us context what we're dealing with properly so that we're not shaming ourselves in areas where it doesn't make sense to do that. 8th thing you may not have learned growing up with complex PTSD is that other people are chronically taking cues from you around how to interact with you. And sometimes what you think is senseless rejection is in fact a product of other people not knowing how to read you properly. So growing up with toxic shame or complex PTSD means that you usually learn to inhibit quite a bit of your self-concept. But you might not be conscious of the fact that you are doing that because you learned to do it so young to hide certain emotions or certain inner states from the people around you that you might actually have no idea that you are not wearing your emotions on your face and your body to the same degree as other people. So you might see other more secure-leaning people walking around the world, interacting with each other, and being quite naturally attuned to each other. You might see one person sitting down, having a kind of rough day, looking forlorn, and another person coming up and asking them, "Hey, what's up? It seems like you're feeling down. Do you want to talk about it?" Or coming over and telling them a joke to cheer them up, whatever it is. And then you might notice that on the days where you're feeling forlorn or down, nobody comes to you and asks you what's wrong or offers to cheer you up with a joke. And you might start internalizing, people just don't care about me. I am just not as worthy a person as other people. Or else people would also be coming up to me and showing me the same care that they give to each other. But you might be missing a really crucial piece of information here, which is that others might not be able to read you as clearly as they can read other more secure-leaning people, because you probably do have a significant amount of emotional inhibition going on that you are not aware of. So when you're feeling down or when you're struggling with something, the look on your face might be one of grumpiness that other people kind of read as "don't talk to me." Or you might chronically mask in a way that causes you to always look upbeat and cheerful, even when you are absolutely dying inside. And when this is the case, other people do not get the appropriate cues from you. Ergo, they don't know how to check in with you and attune to you the way that they do to each other. But this is not necessarily because they don't care about you. It could be because they have no idea what is going on for you. This can become a kind of spiraling problem, because if you don't know how to access a lot of your emotion states and emote them to other people, you might also have trouble forming close connections. So this might make it into the realm of reality where you truly do have less people who are coming to you and checking in on you and vice versa, because you haven't learned the connecting skills that other people learned early on, a key part of those being showing your emotions a little bit all of the time. And of course, this problem is again compounded by the fact that if you have trauma triggers online, your emotions might be much bigger than the average person's, especially if you've not received any support for working through that trauma. So by adulthood, you might be unconsciously and consciously inhibiting. But the important thing here to keep in mind is just to note that we want to make sure we're giving things the right attribution. So if you notice that you struggle socially more so than the average person, either in terms of forming connections or forming intimate connections that you can actually rely on for emotional support, it probably isn't because you're just flawed and broken and someone who nobody would ever care to be close to. It might be because there are social skills you genuinely missed learning about early on in life that make it hard for other people to know how to connect with you. And this is, once again, something that can be worked on in the healing process. But what we're looking at today is just putting everything into the right context. And this is one we want to stay really aware of. Ninth thing you may not have learned if you have complex PTSD is that good people do bad things. And the degree to which we recover from those bad things and learn how to behave in a more pro-social way is often in direct proportion to how much love and guidance we receive. If, when you were young, anytime you made a mistake or messed something up or hurt somebody, which everybody does, every person out there makes mistakes and hurts other people, sometimes really badly. When we have people and environments and communities that we trust who can help guide us through those mistakes and show us how to behave in a more pro-social, empathetic way without writing us off as people in the process of that, that is how we learn to exist in a healthy way in the world. And as adults, if we are not used to receiving any sort of guidance or support from our environments, when we make mistakes and when we hurt people, instead of looking around us for guidance and care and empathy and help in righting our wrongs, we learn to simply inhibit, berate ourselves and go back into those toxic shame beliefs of I am a bad person who hurts other people. But a big thing that it's important to internalize in the healing process is that mistakes will happen for the rest of your life. And as we start to heal from insecure attachment or complex PTSD or early trauma, one of the main things we learn is that if we are honest with ourselves and other people about why we made the mistakes we did and why we hurt people in the ways that we did, we slowly learn over time how to behave in a way that respects both our pain and other people's pain in equal measure. And the healthier we get, the more we learn to surround ourselves with healthy others who can do that kind of work with us and who can hold us and support us through the mistakes we make. And we slowly learn that other people are the resources we need the most when we are messing up the most. Relationships are not supposed to be the things that we pull ourselves back from and deprive ourselves of when we are struggling. They are the very resource that is going to help us out of that struggle if and when we don't have the answers we need for how to change on our own. And this is one that likely takes a long time to start correcting, because we need to learn to trust in small increments, and we need to learn to have good discernment about which people to surround ourselves with in small increments. And so again, this often happens over a period of years in the attachment and trauma healing process. But that process of being honest with others and receiving feedback and being loved and held through our mistakes is one that we need to navigate the rest of our lives in a secure way, because we will not ever, in any version of reality, be able to design a life in the future where we never again make a mistake. The best we can do, any of us, complex PTSD or no complex PTSD, is design a life where we are held, cared about, and supported through our mistakes, both internally and externally as much as is reasonable. 10th thing, though really this list could stretch on into eternity, that you may not have internalized if you grew up with complex PTSD, is that hope often comes about from a change in circumstances, and that we can actually act our way into a better inner world. And this might sound very silly to you if you did not grow up with complex PTSD. You might have no idea what I'm talking about. But essentially, when you do grow up with complex PTSD, one of the core traits is that you have learned helplessness. Because when you were a child, you may have been truly powerless over the circumstances that you were in. You may have learned that there's no way to change your circumstances. Ergo, if you want to have a different feeling, other than the feelings of frustration, anger, hopelessness, whatever it is that are a product of your environment, you have to learn how to dissociate into a fantasy world where everything is perfect and nothing hurts. And when we learn to regulate ourselves that way, we can develop a huge blind spot around the fact that things like hope and happiness and love can be found in the world outside of us, not just in the world that exists inside of our minds and imaginations. And once again, that video on emotional neglect that I have linked in the description of this video is going to be really helpful here for kind of wrapping your mind around the disconnect that you might chronically be experiencing between your inner world and your outer world. But the idea is that as we go through the healing process of complex PTSD, what we learn is that now, as adults with much higher degrees of agency than we had as children, we're now able to go out and interact with the world in a way that genuinely changes our inner emotional state as a true reflection of what's happening in our outer world, not because we are fantasizing about a different world. And so sometimes in our adult lives, we're going to have to go after hope and optimism with a club and learn to proactively seek out environments and opportunities that will put more hope into our true reality. And when we have more hope and opportunity in our lives, our inner state begins to heal as an authentic response to what's going on around us, not as a product of dissociating from it. So this is essentially the process of learning to strengthen the relationship between your inner world and the outer world, and how those two things interact with each other and can interact with each other in a way that is highly positive. But again, this takes some time to learn and deeply internalize. It's about slowly increasing our agency and our connecting abilities to the point where we learn that the world outside of our minds is actually a much better place to exist than the world inside of our minds. Because the world outside of our minds is a world that is real and that can offer us meaning in ways that our fantasy world could never properly give us. And this becomes clearer and clearer the longer we walk down that path towards healing from complex PTSD. All right, this has been quite a bit for today, so I am going to leave it at this, though again, there are many, many, many more lessons that we could have internalized that would have been really helpful for our processing early on if we have complex PTSD. But what I hope is that this has given you some context on some of the things that you may once have chalked up to just being a terrible person, and that you can now start to see yourself in a little bit more of a holistic way, which is really important for all of the work that we do when we start to heal from this. As always, any questions, comments, perspectives you have, please leave in the comment section of this video. I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you back here again really soon.